You may have noticed our surplus of altar servers today. It's good to have a number of our servers here with us. That today they are a small representation of our Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. That our scouts are here with us at this Mass. Following the celebration of the Mass, we're going to have the handing out of some of their religious awards from this past year. And I look back on my time in Scouts with great fondness, that I enjoyed it, and for me as a kid growing up, as much of a bookworm and a homebody as I was, it was good for me because it forced me, as the kids nowadays say, to touch grass. That it made me go outside and be social and engage nature more than I would have otherwise. Which I think in our day and age, now more than ever, is important, not just kind of in a vague sense for our well-being, but actually for the practice of our faith. That there is something in being forced to be bored and to be social that actually teaches us a little bit better to raise our mind to God, when otherwise in our day and age we might be disinclined. We might stop short of Him and rest with idols, with the creature rather than the Creator. It's one of the things that I found interesting in our readings this weekend, that on this celebration of the Most Holy Trinity, we had readings which, largely I think were picked out because they had some reference, at least, whether directly or obliquely, to the Trinity, to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or to God's title in the Old Testament. But one of the things I found interesting about the readings, too, if we pay attention, as beautiful as they are, kind of pulled out of context as praises to God in various forms, if we pay careful attention, they're often contextualized within a culture that has turned away from God. That our first reading from the book of Exodus is immediately adjacent to the worship of the golden calf. That the first reading presents us with Moses, God appearing before him, the handing on of the Ten Commandments on the stone tablets. But that's presented in the same period of time. It's like the same larger occasion in which the people forsake God and turn to the worship of Baal, or whichever god happened to be represented by the golden calf. That we see the worship of God according to His true name presented to us at the same time that we see the worship of idols too. In our responsorial psalm, we hear this beautiful song of praise that in the context comes from Daniel and the worship that's given by the three young men from the middle of the fire that they've been thrown into because they refused to worship the golden statue. And once again, at least in this case, we're presented with the worship of a false idol, and for once, the people of God not engaging in that. And the way that God saves them in the midst of the punishment that's leveled against them because they choose not to, because they refuse to follow a false god. I think in 21st century America, when we read passages from the Old Testament like this, we can look back and think, like, how quaint and how silly. How could anyone possibly think that they ought to worship a false idol? Why did anybody think this was a good idea? Who would be dumb enough to fall into such a temptation? Except I think when we pay careful attention to our own lives, we discover that it happens maybe a little bit more often in our day and age than we think also. As a priest, like most parents, have my very proud dad moments, and I have my very embarrassed, like toddlers sitting on the ground screaming in the middle of the grocery store moments too. That I remember in my first assignment being somewhat surprised and maybe slightly dismayed when I discovered that our varsity baseball team had decided that one of the baseball helmets was lucky and that they had been winning games because that baseball helmet had happened to be seated on the water cooler during the games that they had played. When I discovered this, I had to crush that false idol very quickly. I was sorely tempted to see just how sturdy that helmet was and whether or not I could run over it with my car. Instead, I just removed it from their possession. They did not have that false idol beside them on the sidelines or in the dugout at their baseball games anymore. And I gently, or perhaps not so gently, reminded them that if they won a baseball game, it was because of their effort and God's good grace, and if they lost a baseball game, it was similarly because they messed up and didn't put in the effort or the time. That it had nothing to do with a helmet that they weren't even wearing. That they may not have thought about it in those same terms, but they were worshiping an idol. That they were giving power to an inanimate object that was due to God or man alone. That they had turned something innocuous into something that could have distracted them from the glory due to God alone. That was a little bit of an embarrassed dad moment. One of my proud dad moments happened at the same assignment with, actually, I think the same class of students. That I remember a couple of my students, without my instigating it, a couple of the boys had decided that their tech addiction and accompanying vices had gotten to the point where they needed to take more drastic measures to do something about it. And so they had traded in their smartphones for dumb phones. That they had phones on them, they could still call, they could still text, but they couldn't access data or the internet anymore. And I had to say, like, not only was that an impressive show of self-restraint and self-denial, but I thought that was a somewhat courageous act. That, especially in our day and age, I find that it's easy for our students to feel left out or even a little bit made fun of by classmates if they don't have the latest phones, or at least at the bare minimum don't have access to all of the social media that the other students do. And so I was highly impressed by that. And I think as time went on, they even were able to encourage a few more of their classmates to do the same. That was a powerful act, especially nowadays, because I think when we look at the various false idols that we can worship, I think there are few that with as great of frequency kick Jesus from his throne in our heart like technology does. Which I think it's important for us to clarify at the outset does not mean that technology is bad. That often things are greater temptations for false worship the better they are. That it isn't things of no import that we're tempted to worship. It's things that are great goods. That actually the more readily something can be mistaken for God, the more readily we worship it. St. Paul talks about that in his letter to the Romans, where he says that our ancestors, there was a certain sense in our ancestors worshiping the celestial bodies, the sun and the moon and the stars, in worshiping natural forces of great power like the sea. But they didn't go far enough. That they understood there was great power there, but they failed to recognize that those things were mere creatures rather than the creator. That they worshiped the works of art rather than the artist. They didn't perceive God in his handiwork. And I think we have the same temptation with our phones, whether or not we would express it that way. That there is great good and great power in having so much ability to communicate and having so much readily accessible information at our fingertips. That never in the history of the human race have we been able to know as much as we know now in any given moment, simply with a question thrown into a search engine or now asked of an AI. That there is some great good in the technology that most of us carry in our pockets. But the danger is that technology, because of its goodness, can become a profound source of distraction. And setting aside for a moment the whole biological discussion of drowning in our dopamine in our day and age, there's a remarkable public speaker and author who is a professor at Harvard of psychology by the name of Arthur Brooks. And the guy is a practicing Catholic, a very devout Catholic, though, obviously, because he's teaching at Harvard, his psychology class doesn't stand on the faith. That he teaches on these topics from a natural perspective. But his pet projects, the topics about which he's most passionate, are happiness, boredom, and tech addiction. I think for just about every single one of us gathered here at this celebration of the Mass, at least one of those topics has to hit close to home. If we don't struggle with tech addiction and we don't struggle with boredom, we probably at least want to be happy. I think that's a reasonably safe assumption. And one of the points that he makes, one of his central theses, is that from a variety of pieces of evidence and studies, it seems clear that in the human brain, there are two completely different kinds of pathways that motivate our thinking and that fire when we dedicate our minds to solving problems. That there is the mode of thinking that tries to solve complicated problems. That this is problem solving, this is mathematics, this is the hard sciences. And then he said there's the kind of thinking that tries to solve complex problems. That these are the kinds of problems that don't necessarily have an answer, or maybe have 1,000 answers. That these are the kind of problems that are addressed by philosophy and theology. That these are the questions that we ask when we've had enough time by ourselves without active stimulation to get bored and start thinking about our lives. That these are the hard questions of life. Why do I exist? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why is nature this way rather than that way? That the complicated problems are often the what questions, and the complex problems are the why questions. And one of the things that I appreciated so much about Boy Scouts is it gave us enough of an opportunity to be out in nature, to be hanging around one another without every moment of our lives scheduled or every moment of our lives with someone entertaining us, that we got to ask complex questions, that we got to actually think about difficult things and ponder the beauty of nature, at least insofar as a 13-year-old boy is capable of doing that, that we were allowed to be left to our own devices enough to grow meaningfully in our friendships with each other, and through the opportunity to ask difficult questions in a certain but a nuanced but very real way, to grow closer to God too. Because the point that that Arthur Brooks makes, one of his central points, is that our day and age has so emphasized the complicated questions over the complex ones that our emphasis on technology has allowed our brains to so develop the muscles of problem solving and mathematics that it's left to some extent by the wayside the ability to ask the why questions, that we're not given enough boredom to ask the meaning of our lives. We're not given enough time away from distraction and stimulation to develop close friendships. That we have all the communication in the world, but our relationships tend to be more surface level than they have been before. And both of those things impact not only our relationship with other human beings, they impact our relationship with God, because they make it more difficult for us to hear God's voice, to pray deeply, and to ask the difficult questions which God himself desires to answer in our hearts. Mathematical questions, questions of efficiency, those are questions that God doesn't need to address. Those are questions you and I can figure out by best practices. The question of why I exist, that's something that's not easily plugged into a calculator. That Arthur Brooks argues that the dependence on cell phones has robbed us of the ability to be bored, and thus robbed us of the same strength to ask the difficult questions that the human race used to have. And it's one of the changes he said he's made in his own life. In spite of the fact that he's in his mid to late 60s, he said he is not immune to tech addiction. And so one of the life changes that he made after engaging in enough studies to see how dangerous this was for him is that he forces himself to schedule multiple periods throughout his day where he's not allowed access to his phone or the computer. That he has to engage with other people, he has to read a book, he has to touch grass. And he said it has been one of the single best changes that he's made over the course of his entire life. That it has allowed him to pray more deeply than he did before. It has allowed him to find greater peace of heart and happiness than he had prior to the change. That he said he feels it's made him a better husband, a better dad, and a better Catholic. That when mindful of the fact that when he speaks in public, his faith is not the central thesis, but he said that in a Catholic context, it's made a world of difference for his faith, because it's allowed him enough quiet to be able to hear the Lord talk and not mistake God's creations for God. That it has allowed him the opportunity to remove the phone from that throne in his heart where Jesus himself is supposed to sit. And so as we celebrate this Holy Trinity Sunday, we worship a God who made us in his image and likeness. And I think it's worth asking the question, what does that mean? And what does God being a Trinity add at all to the knowledge of God that you and I had in our Jewish roots? Like, as monotheists, as people who worship one God rather than 1,000 of them, why does the fact that God is a Trinity matter? Like, what value does that add to our relationship with him that he felt the need to share that? And I think probably the single biggest reality that points out to us that we didn't know before is that God is in relationship. That from the very beginning, God himself was already a loving, committed family. And that if that's what God is, and you and I are made in his image, then that's something that's meant to be a central part of how you and I live too. But if I'm spending most of my contact with other people where our relationship is mediated by a screen, it becomes difficult for that relationship to develop any depth. That it's harder for us to image God in our relationships in this life, and it is harder for us to reflect upon God in our relationships in this life. And so this Holy Trinity Sunday, I think, can be theologically intimidating, but it has very profound practical application. That it is God reminding us through his church that you and I were not just made for stuff. That as awesome as all of the things that we have in our lives are, none of those things are meant to satisfy our hearts. Other human beings and God himself are the only things that can do that. And whether it's a baseball helmet or that 2-pound paperweight in our pockets, we shouldn't allow physical stuff to take the place in our hearts that only God is meant to hold.